Okay. All right. Hi, Natalie. Welcome. Thank you
Hi.
so much for coming and sharing your time and your story and your victory and your wisdom and just all that you have to offer for the folks that are taking our course. I'm just thrilled and delighted and honored that you would choose to do this for us. So, why don't we jump right in? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with grief, who it is that you lost, and how long ago, and how the process has been thus far?
Okay, sounds good. So my name is Natalie Benson. I'm from Minnesota. And on June 30th, my husband, Dan, was diagnosed with a stage 4 brain glioblastoma. And it was quite sudden. He had been experiencing weakness on his right side. And there was other symptoms, but we didn't recognize that until after he was diagnosed, when we started putting the pieces together. So for the most part, weakness on the right side. The day that we were moving out of our old house, he fell down a flight of stairs. That really worried me. And then the day we moved into our new house, he ran into a wall. And I said at that point, you need to go to the ER he works at a hospital and just have them check you out. We thought he had an inner ear infection. And so when he called me a few hours later and said that he had brain cancer, it was completely and totally shocking. Like, we had no framework whatsoever. And so he was sent to the neuro ICU downtown Minneapolis. And we thankfully got the best doctor that you can get. People fly from all over the world just to meet with this doctor, because Dan's glioblastoma was like the size of a duck egg. And so it took up the
Wow.
majority of his brain. Um, and and so because of that, he was in neuro ICU with 10-minute neuro checks, because if that tumor were to break, it would kill him instantly. So it was very serious. And so we were told on July 4th that he was going to have brain surgery on July 5th, and that it would either be a biopsy, or they would go ahead and try and take out the entire tumor. Found out the morning of July 5th, it was just going to be a biopsy. And so we went to bed on July 4th, with a lot of apprehension. I would say probably a healthy dose of fear, because we were still quite in shock over what was happening so quickly. And I had a dream, and in the dream, I was in this big hall, and Dan was across the way, far away, in a 3-way mirror up on a pedestal, and an angel was fitting him for a tuxedo. And as I was standing there looking at how beautiful he was, because he was perfect, Jesus walked up beside me, and I saw him out of my peripheral. And Dan turned around on the pedestal, and when he did, Jesus went, and when he did that, I felt inside me Jesus' love for Dan. And I realized really quickly, as Dan starts talking to Jesus about their love for one another, that I did not love Dan like Jesus loved Dan. And it was really incredible, because I loved Dan like he was my best friend. We were married 22 years. We had a very good, healthy marriage. We argued sometimes, but everybody does that. Um, and so I was shocked at how inadequate I felt in that moment watching Jesus and Dan, because I knew that I didn't love Dan the way that Jesus did.
Mhm.
And so at the end of it, Jesus turned to me and he said, I haven't forgotten about you. This room popped up out of the bottom, and in it was this brown wedding dress, which basically has to do with financial stability and being able to like make money for yourself. And so I woke up from that dream and went to the bathroom in his room and cried for an hour, because it felt very much like Jesus had shown me prophetically that this experience was going to end with Dan dying. And that really scared me. But at the same time, I was wrestling in my head with how perfect that love felt in that moment. And so I had started to calm down, and Jesus said, I want you to share this with Dan. And so I wrestled for a long time, finally submitted to God's will, and went out and climbed in bed with Dan, and I started to share it. And when I got to the part where I was telling Dan that Jesus took a gasp when he saw him, Dan went, shh. And when he did, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. And I didn't know what was going on, but Dan quickly said, Jesus is standing at the end of my bed. And for 2.5 hours, Jesus stood there talking to Dan. And I won't share those things, but by the end of it, like, we had been completely delivered from fear, from apprehension, from any kind of worry. And it's been such a complete job. Like, even now, I can't worry, I can't fear. It's perfect peace, because he just, like, Jesus is love, and perfect love casts out fear. And so when you experience that perfect love, like, it's impossible to get to fear when you're with perfect love.
Yeah.
And so at the end of that 2.5 hours, all of a sudden the nurse came in for the first time, and she's supposed to be doing 10-minute neuro checks, and she had just like forgotten about us for 2.5 hours, which was such a God thing. And so from that moment forward, we really didn't have any fear or anything, but we also recognized that the encounter that we just had actually wrestled with what we believe as people who are kingdom people, that we pray for healing, that we believe in healing, that we intercede and fast and pray and do all those things until you get your healing. And so it really presented a wrestling with both Dan and I, because we didn't share the dream with, we shared with 4 people. And from that point forward, we knew people needed to have their own process, that other people were really wrestling with this. And so we wanted to make sure that we encouraged other people in their faith, that God was a part of this. The one thing that surprised me the most is that at no time from the time he was diagnosed to the time he passed away did I even think about the enemy. And that was something new for me. And the only thing I can equate it to was that Jesus's love and the things that we were encountering in that time just kept us so enamored with him that the enemy was not even in our thoughts.
Yeah.
And so he started to deteriorate really fast. They had given him a diagnosis of 3 to 6 months. But it was actually 45 days from the day that he was diagnosed to the day that he passed. And when he passed, there was all these supernatural things that happened that just brought so much peace. But I want you to know, like, in the midst of that, there was moments where I would have real gifts of faith that I would feel come on me, and I would get up and I would pray for him, and I would intercede that his body would be healed, that this brain tumor would go, that Jesus would invade his body. And then I would feel it lift, and I would stop praying. And Dan too, he also several times had that happen. And so even though, like, we had the dream, we were still very much, interceding for his healing. And then after he passed, we prayed for him to be resurrected, because that is who I am. Like, I believe that at any moment God can resurrect somebody from the dead and they can have a testimony of this situation that they just went through.
Mm-hmm.
And so we prayed for about 5 or 10 minutes for him. And then we were like, okay, he's not coming back. And then at that point, that was, I think, probably when the first wave of grief hit, like a crashing wave over us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How long ago was that?
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
So how has it been? You talk about this kind of supernatural peace that you abided in from the point of diagnosis to the point of his passing, and that you have sustained that peace, but like, just talk about the tension between like grief being very real, but yet peace being very real simultaneously. Because I think that people feel like you can't have both at the same time. And that's been my experience too, that you can have extreme heartache and extreme joy and peace simultaneously, actually. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really interesting, the thoughts that I would say people in America specifically have attached to, or, the American culture has attached to grief, because Americans don't really like to grieve. Or if they do, like once the funeral has passed, they kind of just want to move on. And some very well-meaning people can actually hurt you because they don't understand why you're still, like, they'll be like, oh, you're still depressed. Why are you still depressed? I'm like, dude, it's week 6. Like, and I'm not depressed. Like,
all right.
but there's waves of grief that hit. And it's the strangest little things that you don't expect to hit. And it's in the most inopportune times.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that there isn't peace, and it doesn't mean
right.
that there's joy. But like when I was walking at the Mall of America a couple of weeks ago, I saw an old couple walking through the mall holding hands, and I lost it.
Yeah.
And I sat down on a couch and I cried for probably 30 minutes, and it was sobbing.
Yeah.
And I had lots of people looking at me like she's lost it. I had a police officer come up and be like, are you okay? And I was like, yep, I'm totally fine. I just lost my husband in death and something triggered it, and I'm just allowing it to wash over me, and it'll pass and I'll be fine.
Yeah.
But it's like, we really don't know how to deal with those waves of grief in a way that's healthy. And so a lot of times people that are going through grief and mourning the loss of a loved one feel the need to try and have to hold it together, or defer grief to a time when they're alone, as opposed to when it hits. Mm-hmm. And I've taught myself to just let the wave hit.
Mm-hmm. So much of what you're saying is so good. It's like, yes. I think that the thing about letting it wash over you, and not to know that it's going to pass, to let it come and to experience it, I call it like sitting with it, but to not wallow in it, to not stay in that place is so vital and important. And you have to learn as you go. But the most frustrating part for me is that you can't schedule it. I would always say, like, you or schedule it. And the days that I fully prepared for it to be really hard, like the days like when we buried my mom's ashes, I was fully prepared for that to be a very hard day. And we went to the tombstone, and I was like, okay, let's go get lunch, but then I was walking through a thrift store and a Christmas song came on that reminded me of like how much she loved Christmas, and I could hardly like get out of the store without losing it. And so that's the most frustrating thing, is that, yes, it's illogical. It's going to show up probably when you don't want it to show up, but learning how to navigate, learning how to like let it have expression, but not ruin your day or dictate your life, that you can let it out, but then continue to go on with your day and continue to move forward. And I think that that's a skill that is going to serve us well the rest of our lives, you know, because when you can learn to be so in tune with yourself emotionally and what you're needing at any given moment, to honor what your soul's needing and still move forward and be productive and healthy, as you know, in relationships and so many other things. So it's just awesome. It's just awesome. And it's awesome that you're walking in this much clarity and healing like this soon afterwards, you know, because there is a certain amount of shock and everything that your brain literally has been discombobulated, and your brain needs a chance to restabilize. So that's amazing.
Well, I think that's probably one of the reasons why Jesus did things the way he did, was because when you walk in that breaker anointing, there's something that he's wanting to release in this time in history that we as people who walk in the kingdom of heaven, or who are from the kingdom of heaven, carry. And if we aren't willing to help people learn what it looks like to grieve in the kingdom, nobody's going to do it, because
Yeah.
the models that are out there, you know, are very old wineskins, or so new agey and really weird.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be caught dead like being a part of that group, or
Yeah.
they're stuck completely
Yeah.
and they can't move forward. And so
Yeah.
what the Lord was speaking to me about was how important it was in every part of the grief cycle to remember that my actions and how I'm feeling and how I'm portraying myself around people has to be genuine and authentic, but it also has to represent the kingdom of heaven,
Yeah.
because we don't get a free pass from grief and loss when we're in the world. Like,
Yeah.
we're always at every moment representing heaven on earth. And so making sure that we represent heaven even in the grieving season is really important to me, at least.
Yeah.
And so I like how you said sitting in it. I call it diving in. And the place that I got that from was, you know how it talks about in scripture about searching for the deep things of God.
Mm-hmm.
And even the man who finds the pearl of great price, like, he was digging in his field. He
Mm.
wasn't just looking at it. He was digging in this field and he found something. And what I have found is, as I dive into those waves of grief, there are things underneath that wave at the bottom of it that are precious kingdom treasures.
Mm.
And it takes us diving into that wave to find those. And this is what makes us different than those who grieve in the world, or those who walk in depression. Like, they would dive into the dark place to get inspiration. We're diving into the dark place. Sorry, not the dark place. We're diving into the deep places of God to come up with new revelation of what he wants to do in us and through us in the midst of this grief and pain and loss.
Yeah. Well, and another thing, and it sounds like, I know that your walk with the Lord and your relationship with the Lord was like so solid even before this, but one of the gifts and opportunities I think it brings is that you can't really know the depth of your faith or your love or your devotion or your trust until it's tested. Actually, the world demands that it be tested. And so, you know, for when I lost my mom to suicide, I would have told you before that I trusted God implicitly and that I, you know, trusted him with everything. And then my mom took her life, and turns out I didn't trust him as much as I thought I did. But how, like, I'm so thankful that that was exposed, because
Yeah.
you can't know until something's tested. And how can you possibly fix or repair a breach if you don't know that it's there? And so while it's so hard to walk through these seasons while it's so hard to maybe see or recognize that there are some holes or chinks in your relationship with the Lord or your faith or whatever it is, like what a gift it is.
Yes.
To see those things clearly and have the opportunity for them to be mended. Because I had my mom not died, I don't know that I ever would have, known with such clarity, like how much my trust in the Lord was actually lacking. And because of that, we were able to establish a very real trust, which is the thing that upheld me when my son passed away, So I just one of the biggest things I try to convey in this course and help people to grapple with, which is such a hard pill to swallow, is the gift that these seasons bring us, that it's not all bad. It's not all awful. God's not trying to punish you. Like if you'll let him, there's a real, and you spoke of that. There's treasures to be found. There are things that we can grab hold of that if we didn't go through this, we wouldn't have had access to. And so I'll just keep saying again, like it's just really amazing that so shortly after, that you're so new into it and walking in all these things. And so you're an example of dispelling the myth of that it needs to take years and years. Like who said this? Who decided that grief process and you need to be miserable and sad for years on end? Like that's just not true.
Yeah. Well, and I've also, had several people be like, you're just in denial. And I laugh at that because I'm like, no, I'm not in denial. Like I live every moment of every day with the loss of my husband. He was my best friend. We had a date night every night. That's by far my hardest night of every single week, is that night when we would spend together. And that was something that we started 10 years ago because we realized that we were more important than our relationships with our kids, because someday they were going to be gone, but we would still be together. And so we started sowing into our marriage so that it could be strong. And so 10 years of the same night every week, going out together and spending time together, like that's a big one. I mean, it crashes down on me, and there's days when I embrace it, and there's days when I dread that day coming, and then there's days when I try and fill it with other things so they don't have to think about it. So there's like different ways to handle it, and there's no right and wrong way, but it's all real. Like, just is not easy on that day. But I'm not in denial, and I'm fully accepting. In fact, I'm really grateful to God for the grace that he's given me to walk through it. But I think that started, I was sharing with you the other day, that started 3 months before Dan got diagnosed. I lost my job and I was devastated. And that's when the grieving started. And talk about getting mixed up when you have a lot of grief happen. So Dan's mom had died not even a year before that. So I'm still mourning the loss of Dan's mom. And then I lose my job, and there was some identity wrapped up in that job. And it's all I'd ever done was be in the ministry. And so for the first time, like the Lord's stirring up identity issues and wanting to deal with me with my heart, because I was wrestling with trying to understand what had happened. And he was wanting me to choose peace. I had to start exercising that muscle of coming out of agreement with trying to understand and choosing to have peace that passes understanding, because peace trumps understanding. And so in exercising that muscle every day for 3 months, when Dan and I were in the hospital room together and we were sitting there, I still remember Dan going, saying, well, this is just another chance for us to choose peace over trying to understand why on earth this happened.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't come overnight. God often puts us through really fiery seasons where he tests us to see what's going to come through. And oftentimes it's through diving into those things and not putting up a wall or shutting down or disassociating. Those are the things that keep us from actually learning what God wants us to learn in that season.
And knowing that, because that he's preparing us for something, that it's almost like conditioning. I used the analogy the other day of like, it's like being recruited to the Olympics without your permission. Like all of a sudden someone shows up and they're like, guess what? You're in the Olympics and you have to wake up at 4 a.m. and you can only eat raw eggs and you do all this stuff that's awful and you don't want to do and you didn't ask for it. But if you'll submit yourself to the conditioning, you have the opportunity to represent your nation and how you choose to do that. You cannot submit to the conditioning but if you will wrap your head around it and just lean into it, there's amazing things to be beheld, at the end of it. So, and as much as we would all like to think, as hard as this is, we would love to think that this is our one and done, like check the box, like I figured out how to, and I hate to say that but I did not know when I was grieving the loss of my mom, like how soon I was going to need those skills.
Yes.
And how thankful I was that I had them when it happened with my son. And so I just embrace and soak every lesson, soak every exercise, build up those muscles, because then whatever comes your way in the future, you're going to be equipped to handle it. And I actually think these muscles that we're building in the deep, dark place are the very muscles that are going to allow us to hold the blessing that God intends to pour out on us.
Yes.
Talks about you won't bless somebody if you can't hold it. And those things that are required to be able to hold amazing stuff, I think are formed in these deep, dark places. So if we can really embrace this season from that point of view and know that it's not always conditioning for just bad thing after bad thing after bad thing, but it's also conditioning to build muscles to uphold amazing blessings and to be able to help other people like we're trying to do, through this course. So it's just all good stuff. It's just, he's good and faithful and amazing.
A lot of people in the kingdom mindset, like Pedro and Chris Valentin, and they all talk about the importance of being grateful and thankful. And for some reason, when we hit a grief season, there's this unspoken rule or thought that somehow doesn't apply because I've had the worst possible thing happen to me. And what I have found is no matter what you're going through, no matter how you lost somebody, whether it was traumatic or a God encounter like it was for me and Dan, no matter whether it was a mother, brother, sister, child, spouse,
right.
There is always somebody who has it worse than you.
Yes.
And when you look at their situation, it causes you to be grateful and thankful that even though what you went through was traumatic and painful, you didn't walk their path. But
right.
what I love about that is that there was so much grace because we had people looking at us going, I can't even imagine it. But when you're walking through it, there's grace on you for it. But it's really important to stir up the thankfulness, which is why the story of Job helped me so much.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, like this is nothing compared to what Job went through. And in light of eternity, this is not going to matter that much. Like if I look at this from an eternal perspective, this is a season, and yes, it will be with me the rest of my life and it will color the way I look at things, but it doesn't give me license to be ungrateful and unthankful.
Yeah, that's so good. And just having more visible examples, right? Because people are so weird about grief and they don't want to talk about it. And sometimes it's a personal thing. And exactly what you said, I know that's what kept me stuck, is that I didn't have I thought I allowed myself to get in this tunnel vision where I was like, nobody can understand and nobody, my mom took her own life, and the suicide support group I went to, those people were, I mean, most of them couldn't work and most of them were just barely functioning. And it had been, 1, 2, 3 years or whatever since the thing, and they were still stuck in it. So I didn't have an example there. None of my friends or family, everybody's like, I can't understand what you're going through. I used to joke that it was like an episode of Dateline, like it was just kind of surreal. And so that got me into this, like, nobody knows my pain, it's too big. And so it wasn't until I saw a speaker who had survived the Rwandan genocide. And I had the privilege to meet her and share with her how much she impacted my life, because she was someone who had been through something much more I had went through. And I saw her standing on stage, healthy and whole and full of joy and full of expectation. And it was like this huge light bulb moment, like, oh my gosh, if she can do it, then I can do it. And everybody goes through varying degrees of adversity. So you are that woman to people, and I am that woman to people. And she was that for me.
Yeah.
If we don't get healed up and share our stories and example, there's so many people sitting stuck, believing the lie that nobody can understand their pain. Nobody has been through anything worse than what they're facing, and they literally can't see a way out of it. So it's so true. It's so powerful. It's so good.
Yeah.
So you're 6 weeks out. I'm going to claim this as a prophetic thing, because shortly after Quentin died, I was lucky enough to have a pastor in my life who she lost her husband to cancer. And she's like, Kelly, you're not going to suffer for the rest of your life. And she went through a healing process. And for her, it took 18 months. And she's like, I can tell you exactly the moment when I know I was fully healed from grief and I was like healthy and whole. And when she told me that, I said in my head, I'm like, if it took her 18 months, I'm going to do it in less, because, her victory is now my floor and I can do it in a shorter period of time. And, I don't have a definitive day, but I would honestly say between 3 to 6 months after my son passed away, I was, and I still have pockets of sadness. I think of it every day. And sometimes the pocket lasts 30 seconds or 3 minutes or whatever. And I just let it be there and I keep going on with my day. It's not that it's erased from me, but I would say that I was healed from that and walking in wholeness in that time frame. So you, my friend, are now becoming like a new bar for all of us, and that people can be walking in that so much sooner than what they think or what the world would tell them,
Yeah, it's really true. Like I think one of the things, because it was such, so those 45 days between diagnosis and when Dan died, that's when my grieving started. Mm-hmm. And especially if you have been caretaking for somebody who's got cancer, or you've been walking through a process with them, like, it doesn't start when they die. You start losing that person long before they've passed away. Like, I have a dad who has end stage Lewy body dementia, and I lost him 2 years ago. Like, the dad that I knew, the dad that I talked to on the phone all the time with, like, he's not the same anymore. And so he may still be alive, but I started grieving the loss of my dad 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I think what is important is that we redefine the expectation of some of the models and some of the examples that are out there, that talk about how grief really doesn't start until after somebody dies.
Right.
That you might be experiencing grief before, but somehow that's different. I don't know that that's actually really true, because I think that the grief is attached to the loss of you losing the person that you used to know, or freedom that came with that, or who they used to be. And that's all part of the healing journey. So by the time that person passes, if they've been sick for a couple of years, I've seen people get over that quite quickly and move on with life, and even marry other people very soon. And although I wouldn't make that the example, they're very happy. But they had done a lot of grieving before that person passed too.
Well, yeah, and it is a different process. I lost when my grandma passed, she passed from stomach cancer. And so and it's a different kind of pain. It's a different, because yes, you get to prepare. I was so thankful that I got to have time and like say everything I wanted to say to her, and like such a gift. Like it was such a gift to have that time with her. But it's also incredibly heartbreaking to watch someone you love sort of deteriorate and be in pain and stuff right in front of your eyes. So but yes, in terms of like, if I had the ability to pick, I would pick that process, just because, yes, it's kind of a gradual, you kind of slowly are coming to terms with it, or slowly this idea of it isn't so sudden as like you get a phone call and it's, it's already done and it's shocking and whatever. But,
ironically, it was Dan's best friend passed away September 29th, 2 years ago. And it was suddenly, he had laid down on the bed and that was it. Like it was over, and his kids found him when they came home from school. It was very traumatic. And so my friend's experience with death was very different from mine, but yet she's had a very unusual experience with God since then, and with her husband, who was doing the finishing up and the processing and those end time conversations after he passed, because they needed that, because it was so traumatic.
Yeah, I guess the point is it hits everyone different, and that's why I'm so glad that we have a variety of experiences and stories and nuggets of wisdom, so that people can take what applies to them and leave the rest for somebody else. And so on that note, I don't want us to end without saying, if you had to you could give one piece of advice, if you had one thing to offer somebody who's, fairly new to walking through this, or maybe even revisiting old grief, what would you advise them?
Yes. Go back. Don't be afraid first to go back and in detail relive those moments of the one that you lost. Whether it's good, whether it was a good experience and you had closure, or whether it was a traumatic experience and there's still trauma attached to it. But go in viewing it from the eyes of heaven. How did God see that situation? When we experience trauma, we tend to rewrite that story and add trauma to it. And so when we go back to those times when our loved one was passing, and we experience it through Jesus' eyes, or through the Holy Spirit's eyes, or through God's eyes, oftentimes we see things that we didn't see when we were walking through it. And it can rewrite that traumatic story for you. And it can turn from a traumatic story to a hope-filled story, because when you see things the way heaven saw it, it's very different than how you see it. And I really recommend that. I've seen a lot of people now walk through that series of events that were surrounding the last moments or the last times with their loved ones. Go back and encounter God in those moments and see where he was, and it completely rewrite the story of how they saw the death of their loved one. And it's by far the most, like when I went back, and even though Dan's passing was incredibly peaceful, like that brain tumor had grown so large and it shifted into his respiratory system. And so he literally just stopped breathing. Like there was no last gasp for air. It was just like he took a breath and then he didn't take another one. And there was no other outward sign that he had even passed. And so we were like, oh my gosh, like that was it. Like he just left. And so, but even in that, when in one of my waves of grief, the Lord said, can you trust me to go back there with me and let me show you what it looked like from my perspective? Wow. It was so beautiful. And there was angels and loved ones in the room with us awaiting it. And, we look at it as a loss because they're not here with us. And so it's a funeral, but for Dan, it was his wedding day.
Yeah.
And Jesus was there waiting for him and anticipating him. And all of a sudden he went from, the valley of the shadow of death look to being completely and perfectly whole. And when that becomes your story and that becomes what you can hang on to, that's hope-filled.
Yeah.
And it's no longer traumatic.
I haven't done that. This is challenging me. I am now and ask that because I haven't done that, but God has, for me, my question and my struggle was like, where were you, God? Like for my sake, where were you in the midst of all this? You're my father, you're my protector. Like, where were you? And so one really cool thing he did with my mom passed away on February 1st. And a couple months prior, Holy Spirit prompted me to just send notes to people that I loved. I had I'm a type A, so I'm like, I'm going to do it every Friday. Like every week, I'm going to send a note to someone else that I love. Well, it only lasted 3 weeks, but in those 3 weeks, so I sent a note to my mom just telling her, and we're Scandinavian, we're good Minnesota people, so we weren't much at expressing our emotions, but I was able to, in writing, tell her just how much she meant to me and how amazing of a mom she was and how much I learned for her. And I didn't even realize as I was writing it, but I wrote, your legacy will live on in me and my children. Like I wrote everything I would have said to her if she was on her deathbed and if I had that opportunity. And, nobody else got that opportunity. And so when I was wrestling with God, he reminded me of that note. And I went and my mom kept it. I went to her house and she had kept it. And so that for me was the thing of God really showing himself faithful, that like, even though this awful thing happened, he was providing for me and protecting me and allowed me to have that final goodbye conversation, even though I didn't know I was having it. And it was so powerful. He really, he really does know. He really is there. He is really looking out for us. But I have not asked him, so now I'm going to ask him.
And I would encourage you and everybody who's taking your class to actually ask God to open your eyes to see in the spirit realm what was happening at the death of your loved one, because there was a lot of activity. There is a lot of activity happening in the spirit realm around you at the death of a loved one, because the death of a saint is precious to the Lord. And it is an event that's important to heaven. And so going back and allowing yourself to feel those emotions, allowing yourself to see what your physical eyes couldn't see, it's so healing and it's very hope-filled.
It's giving me healing right now. I'm almost tearing up because the thing that always bothered me and plagued me with my mom is that I just hate feeling that she was alone, that she was in such a place of desperation and she felt so alone and so hopeless that she couldn't find any other way. And that's just always haunted me, that like, I hate that she was alone. But even just hearing she wasn't alone.
No, she wasn't.
In that moment. And so that is good.
We had two people in the room. We felt it. There's so many stories connected to it. We don't have time to talk about it, but Dan's mom and Dan's best friend, they were in the room probably for a good 24 hours before he passed. And he was talking to them all the time. He wouldn't talk to us anymore. He was transitioning, but he would talk to them by name. He used their names, Rob and Mom. Wow. And so we knew that's who he was talking to. And then right before he stopped talking altogether, he was speaking in another language.
Wow.
And he was, I mean, he was seeing the spirit realm that was more real to him at that point than we were.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
allowing yourself to even imagine it, you know, our imaginations, they were given to us by God so that we could see things that aren't there, and
Yeah.
allowing yourself to imagine what was happening on the other side, it
Yeah.
just really, really helps you to see it from a different perspective.
Yeah. Oh, so good.
Yay.
Hopefully everybody takes your advice and does that and gets massive, massive breakthrough and healing from that. But
Amen.
such a pleasure, such a joy. Thank you. I can't thank you enough for being willing to share your thoughts and your heart with us. And you'll continue to be an example of what grieving looks like in heaven here on earth. And I think so many people are going to be blessed by watching you continue to walk through it and see that they can, you know, walk in healing and freedom. So thank you so much, Natalie.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too.
Alrighty.